From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening. I'm Anne McLean from the library's music division. I'm very pleased tonight to be introducing a new colleague in the concert office, Nikolas Alexander Brown. His lecture tonight is 20th Century Masters, Britain's Coolidge Commission, and Shostakovich's Soviet Redemption. I know quite a few of you have probably made Nick's acquaintance already this season, but let me take a moment to tell you a little about his background in education and his experience, which includes working with a number of prestigious performing and presenting organizations. Nick received his bachelor's degree in music from Brandeis, majoring in conducting, and he holds a master's degree in musicology from King's College London. But this excellent academic background is only part of an energetic and enthusiastic involvement in chamber, choral, and orchestral music that make him a valuable addition to our team of producers. He has founded the Irving Fine Society Singers and Ensemble, comprising a chamber choir and orchestra, which he still runs, box office and backstage work at Tanglewood, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and he has performed with the London Symphony Chorus and the BBC Chorus. He has guest conducted the Orchestra Philharmonia of Honduras and held an internship at the White House, managing events for the social office in the office of the First Lady. Here at the library, he's the conductor of the Library of Congress Chorale. In his spare time, he's interested in studying the role of music in 20th century society. Please welcome Nikolas Brown.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Library of Congress and this beautiful room here, the Whitall Pavilion, which is one of the key spaces for us in the music division, as well as the Coolidge Auditorium, which you will enjoy later tonight for the concert. So my idea tonight is just to give you a brief introduction into some of the themes that make Benjamin Britten and Dimitri Shostakovich two of the most significant musical figures of the 20th century, both of whom completely transformed the musical scene for their respective countries, the United Kingdom and Russia, otherwise known as the Soviet Union, for most of the 20th century. Tonight, we're so pleased to have the distinguished Takács Quartet at the library to perform Schubert's 13th Quartet in A minor, Rosamunde, as well as Benjamin Britten's first quartet, Opus 25. Britten's first quartet was commissioned by Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge. Of course, she is the founding patron of our concert series here at the library, which was founded in 1925. In addition, pianist Marc-André Hamelin will join the Takács Quartet for Shostakovich's Piano Quintet, Opus 57, which earned the composer the Stalin Prize in 1941. So we have two works here that sort of came to fruition in 1941 that give a perfect glimpse into these two composers as they developed their musical voices, their personal ideologies, and also their place in a society which, for the most part, didn't agree with a lot of what they had to say. But there's some conflict and gossip which we'll get into. So while these two composers were certainly not the only ones in their respective countries to have an impact on their national musics, their connection to societal current events particularly played a role in giving them the voice that they have now in history. Maybe in 1941, we didn't all know who Benjamin Britten was, but today in the 21st century, we can look back and think of who are the major British composers of the 20th century, and he is, if not the top of that, one of the few top. I'd like to introduce you to a quote here that's just a little bit of food for thought for some of the facts I'm going to share with you today. It is only those who accept their loneliness and refuse all the refuges, whether of tribal nationalism or airtight intellectual systems, who will carry on the human heritage. This was excerpted by Benjamin Britten in an article he wrote in Modern Music, and it is attributed to Wistan Auden, who was, of course, one of Britten's longtime confidants and mentors in various different areas in terms of artistic endeavors and also in personal situations. So let's get into Benjamin Britten for a few minutes. He was born in 1913 in the English countryside on the East Coast and the Suffolk coast in a village called Lowestoft. His mother, Edith, was the early equivalent of a stage mother back then. She had determined that her son Benjamin was going to be one of the 4 Bs, which meant Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, and Britten. Some people do feel that that is the case, and I leave it to you to make your own decision about that. He began piano, viola, and composition studies as a child and excelled in all 3 areas. As a teenager, he gained the attention of composer Frank Bridge, who was one of the prominent English voices in the musical scene at that time. Frank Bridge became his principal composition teacher through his early 20s and a lifelong mentor and close friend. As a teenager, Britten attended a typical British public school, which is comparable to our American prep schools or private schools, named Gresham's. This is where he very much started to enjoy the conflict with establishment, and at times he was not entertained in the musical situations that he would have liked, because he was far more advanced than all of his contemporaries. But in this school, he eventually, by voicing his desire to move a little ahead, he formed close relationships with the tutors and especially with the headmaster of the school. Now, it is believed through some secondhand sources that he went through some sort of sexual trauma at this period, which people say impacted his life and his development of understanding his own sexuality, which is something that we will get into a little later. After Gresham's, he entered the Royal College of Music in London, where he studied with the more senior greats in English music, John Ireland and Ralph Vaughan Williams, while of course maintaining the independent lessons with Frank Bridge. And it was very interesting that the Royal College tutors did not like the studies with Frank Bridge. He was not on their faculty, and he kind of represented a different direction of English music that was not to their liking. And of course, if we think of John Ireland and Vaughan Williams compared to someone who's more looking towards the future in Frank Bridge, we could understand why. There was also an interesting relationship with John Ireland in that Ireland very much ignored Benjamin Britten for much of his time as a student, and he would not respond to phone calls or messages or anything, except when they did get together, John Ireland did make the pass at him several times, and Britten always fended it off. But this is an indication of things that happened in Britten's life which came to impact his music. These relationships and situations, whether with teachers or other people or his contemporaries or his friends and colleagues, caused him to think a lot about who he was as a human being. And it took him many years to get to a point where he felt comfortable with himself. And we'll get to the American period shortly, which was from 1939 to 1942. And that was the period where we really see him come into his own. So the years at the Royal College didn't bring Britten many performances of his works, at least as much as he would have hoped. He was gaining a good amount of attention in the scene in London, but for anyone that has spent some time in London, you know that it is as in New York, it's a very difficult scene to break into as a young musician. But somehow he managed to make close personal relationships, which would in turn give him the opportunities that he wanted. And Auden was a perfect example of this. Britten described Auden as, quote, a very startling personality, but absolutely sincere and brilliant, end quote. In 1937, he met the tenor Peter Pears, who would become his lifelong partner and also his vocal muse. There was never a situation where Britten was not thinking about Pears's voice when it came to a tenor role. And Pears, of course, premiered Peter Grimes and was also a performer here at the library in our concert series, which is very exciting. A lot of, if not all of the figures I'm going to talk about today performed at the library or attended a concert at the library, which is absolutely phenomenal to me, and I hope to you as well. In the years leading up to Britten's emigration to America in 1939, which was with Pears, his work for the sake of paying bills was very much focused in the film and radio scoring genres. This was something that also paid the bills for Shostakovich, and Shostakovich had produced music for over 37 films, I believe. A lot of those were propaganda films. I know some of us don't like that word, but films that the government was producing for the sake of urging a certain agenda. And the British were actually doing the very same thing. A lot of Britain's film scores were accompanying films that were being produced by the Royal Mail, for example, that were all, let's build up our British munitions and everything in advance of this war that we know is coming. Prominent compositions from this period pre-America include the Simple Symphony for string orchestra, variations on a theme of Frank Bridge, and Young Apollo, which was for piano and strings. In 1939, Britten, along with peers, left England for North America, principally to spend time away from Britten's romantic interests at the time. The young man's name was Wolf Scherchen. He was the son of conductor Hermann Scherchen, and he was 14 at the time that Britten met him. Britten was 21. Obviously brings some issues into play. And now there's no confirmation that their relationship was anything other than platonic, but it was an intimate, close emotional connection. And here you see a letter from Benjamin Britten, written to Aaron Copland during his voyage across the Atlantic. And the quote from here that I'd like to share with you, which is Britten speaking about why he was leaving England. Quote, "1,000 reasons, mostly, quote, problems have brought me away," end quote. Aaron Copland confirmed in later sources that these problems were basically Britten's cryptic way of referring to Wolf Scherchen and the emotional drama going on there. Another significant influence that drove Britten to leave Britain at this time, yes, this is why I did not want to say Britain. We want to switch to England, because Britain and Britain sound the same. So, Benjamin Britten chose to leave England in 1939. One of the other reasons, besides his personal issues, was the fact that he sensed the fascist movement growing in Europe. Anyone who was living in Europe at that time could sense it. And to a certain extent, he did feel that England was going to be subsumed into this, whether it meant the Germans eventually defeating England or the right-wing factions in England wanting that direction for the nation itself. So eventually he gets to Canada and spends some time there getting in the scene. He had performances done with the CBC Orchestra in Toronto, and he spent some time traveling around. There was one quote which I didn't include today, but he basically, no offense to any Canadians in the house, this is Britten speaking, he said that he would have stayed in Canada had it not been for the fact that there was absolutely no culture there. A little harsh, yes. No, those weren't his exact words, but it was pretty close. So what he did was, in the summer of 1939, he came down to the United States for a couple trips and decided in August to make a permanent move down to New York. As World War II broke out in the beginning of September, of course, he found his anti-war sentiment intensifying, and he suggested that he would like to remain in the United States permanently. Now, Britten was the type that if you read his letters, which the letters and diaries are kept mainly from this period in the 30s and 40s, you see that he changes his mind about everything, as I think most artists would. You know, we go back and forth, we contemplate things, it's our purpose in life. So in the course of 1939 up to 1941, he had started off hoping to stay in America permanently. That's a big step to make, as an artist especially who doesn't have a guaranteed source of income. But by 1941, he had grown incredibly frustrated with life in America. And that was largely exacerbated by his financial difficulties. He began to contemplate a return to England despite warnings from his friends and family, who obviously knew that what was going on with the war was not going to be beneficial to his creativity or to his own physical well-being. Eventually, he did get back to England in March of 1942, but there are a lot of political and ideological things that came into play, which we'll talk about in a moment. Musically, the years in America were a personal maturation for Britten. His musical style came into its own, and he was increasingly more comfortable with his own convictions and sexuality. His relationship with Peter Pears was officially consummated early on in the American years, affirming Pears' crucial, though quite domineering presence in Britten's life. Peter and Benjamin had a very committed relationship for the rest of their lives. However, Peter was very much the domineering force in terms of all kinds of decisions that happened, and in Britten, in the letters that his colleagues wrote, expressed the fact that Britten himself was very dominant in the rest of life, except in this relationship with Peter, Peter's emotional sort of dominance ruled everything that they did as a pair. The musical output from this American period was staggering. Les Illuminations, Opus 18, the Sinfonia de Requiem, Opus 20, his first opera, Paul Bunyan, the first string quartet, which we'll discuss in further, the Hymn to St. Cecilia, and a Ceremony of Carols. Those last two choral works were actually written on the ship back to England in 1942. One thing I'd like to mention about the Sinfonia de Requiem, This was a work that was commissioned by the Japanese government in commemoration of the anniversary of their empire. Obviously, in 1939-1940, Japan's position in the world was a little problematic, at least from an Allied perspective. Nonetheless, Britten dealt with criticism that came his way from Britain and the United States, and he proceeded with the commission. He wrote it, he sent it to the Japanese government, but it was largely a musical story of mourning for dead in conflict, and the Japanese didn't want that for this purpose. They wanted something happy and glorious, and it was just not the right mood, even though Britten's was probably the more accurate picture of society at the time. So what was more significant of this time in America was the personal contacts that Benjamin Britten made. These relationships, as we discussed earlier about his London years, entirely set him up for the rest of his life in terms of commissions, in terms of performances of his works, so on and so forth. One thing I'd like to share with you here is a wonderful picture of Aaron Copland with Benjamin Britten. And as you look at this picture, I want to share with you that the Library of Congress holds the special collections of many of the composers who are at the forefront of American music in the 20th century. We have, of course, the Aaron Copland collection, which is the source of this image right here. And the letter that we just saw, which was from Britten to Copland, is a letter that is in the Copland collection as well. Now, if we take that back a step, you can go to the Kusevitsky collection, who, of course, commissioned Peter Grimes. The conductor, Serge Kusevitsky, commissioned it. So you can see all of Britten's correspondence to Kusevitsky about that commission and other random things in the Kusevitsky files. Then you can go to the Bernstein collection and see Benjamin Britten's letters to Bernstein. So here in this building, and that just touches the tip of the iceberg, not in this building per se, but the Madison building where our reading room is, you can go through these different personal stories of how Benjamin Britten interacted with America's music and musicians throughout his whole life. And you can really feel the sense of this coming to life. And I urge you to think tonight as you go hear the first string quartet, how Benjamin Britten and Mrs. Coolidge sat in that hall, right there where you will sit this evening, in 1941 and heard the East Coast premiere. So, pretty cool things that you can do here at the library. Back in England, Britten's focus turned to opera, in hopes of, as musicologist Philip Brett puts it, quote, contributing something new and powerful to British musical life, end quote. He got his feet wet, so to speak, with Paul Bunyan, which was written in the United States, and he began work on the opera Peter Grimes while he was in the US as well. The commission from Serge Kusevitsky was decided upon in about January of 1942. Peter Grimes is based on the George Crabbe poem of the same title, Peter Grimes, which is set in Aldborough. Aldborough would become the future home of Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears and the site of the festival which Britten and Pears founded by the name of the town, the Aldborough Festival. That festival continues today, and it is one of the most important summer festivals in England, comparable to, not on the same scale, but Tanglewood or Aspen. So basically what Britten tries to do in all of his operas, and Peter Grimes is certainly the most popular and prominent one in the contemporary repertoire, is he attempts to address social issues in a way that's going to reach the public and reach the audience. And it is entirely didactic, and he did not intend for anything else to be the case. According to one musicologist named Hans Keller, Peter Grimes, the character, is, quote, very much of an ordinary weak person who, being at odds with the society in which he finds himself, tries to overcome it, and in doing so, offends against the conventional code, is classed by society as criminal and destroyed as such. Peter Grimes is essentially an autobiographical characterization of Britten, to a certain extent. And I won't get into too much of the details of it, but the sexuality issue is there, and also the issue of being a pariah among, societal norms. What Peter Grimes does in the opera is there's this whole back and forth with the town about him having had these apprentices, and people suspect him of having abused them, and the town basically decides how they're going to deal with this. And Peter Grimes, obviously, from all of that, has an emotional crisis, and it's comparable to a certain extent to what Britten was going through with his own sexuality. And he was well aware that the intimate relationships, the allegedly intimate but definitely close emotional relationships with young teenage boys was a problem, and he was aware of this. Now, Peter Grimes was just one of 17 stage works, excluding ballets, stage works more towards the opera genre, that Britten composed. These ones, of course, include Billy Budd, The Turn of the Screw, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Death in Venice. Over the course of the decades that produced these operas, Britten's popularity grew exponentially. His compositions had a huge lasting impact on many different genres aside from opera. Orchestral, chamber, vocal, and choral genres were all touched by his music, with works such as The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra, the War Requiem, the string quartets, the cantata St. Nicholas for chorus, and the song cycle, The Holy Sonnets according to John Donne. His output was quite prolific in scope and established a uniquely British blend, and feel free to argue with me about the isms that are going to come up, postmodernist, post-romantic, and neoclassical style, which had moments of pseudo-serialism. I wanted to say pseudo, so I threw it. So now let's turn to the first string quartet in depth. We'll get to her in a moment. Like many prominent composers of the 20th and 21st centuries, Benjamin Britten had a special connection to the library, which we've been mentioning. There was a very interesting moment in 1939 when Britten was just arriving in the United States, and he wrote to his publisher and friend Ralph Hawks of Boozy and Hawks in New York. And he said, quote, "It is possible that I could get some kind of work out here, such as secretarial work at the Congress Library," end quote. Yes, it is not generally known that Benjamin Britten, somewhat in a joking manner, wanted secretarial administrative work here at the library. So all of us that work here, we can be proud and we say we outdid Britten in one very small little way, but you know, whatever works. And luckily for us, of course, he didn't get pigeonholed into these administrative ways to earn money. He was able to focus his energies on composing, which the commissions were key to enabling. As early as 1940, Britten had begun considering a string quartet. He had written some pseudo-string quartets in his earlier years as a child. In fact, he had up to 100 pieces from his youth, which had been assigned opus numbers, but he basically threw that out. And his official opus 1 is the Sinfonietta, which he wrote just about the time where he entered the Royal College in London. So the commission of the first string quartet came to fruition from Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge. And she had a knack for identifying these composers in their youth who would come to completely shape American music. The first string quartet was requested in early 1941, and it joins a lineage of some really amazing works. And I'm going to list some of them and then list some of the composers' names. This doesn't even touch how many important works to the history of music reside here in the library, were commissioned by the library's foundations, and it's staggering. So here we go. Samuel Barber's Hermit Songs, Bela Bartok's String Quartet No. 5, Frank Bridges' third and fourth quartets, Aaron Copland's Ballet Appalachian Spring, otherwise known originally as the Ballet for Martha, George Crumb's Ancient Voices of Children, and works by the likes of Hindemith, Honegger, Martineau, Messiaen, Millot, Piston, Poulenc, Prokofiev, Ravel, Respighi, Rorem, Schoenberg, Schuller, Sessions, Stravinsky, Thompson, and I hope you know the difference, and Webern. That's really just this finite amount of what we've done here at the library in history, and it's absolutely amazing. This, of course, is the plaque that sits in the Coolidge foyer, which you'll see once you go into the concert. And it was constructed in commemoration, of course, of Mrs. Coolidge's patronage to the library. So she was introduced to Britten through a letter of introduction from Frank Bridge. Britten wrote to her and joined in there the letter from Frank Bridge, which basically, in those days and still today, but more in the form of an email, a prominent teacher will recommend their student to someone else for whatever it be, whether it be a job, a commission, maybe an orchestral job sometimes, that sort of thing happens. But it's very interesting because Mrs. Coolidge had this long-standing relationship with Frank Bridge. Obviously, she had commissioned him several times, and he had also dedicated works to her. So when this letter came to her, accompanied by Britten's letter, of course she was going to take Frank Bridge's recommendation seriously. Britten had corresponded with Mrs. Coolidge starting in 1939 and continued doing so regularly through his years in the United States, which were 1942. But once he got back to England, the timing was such that Mrs. Coolidge was very up in her age, and they didn't get to see each other as much as they would have liked. Now, Britten's intentions about a commission were very, very obvious from the get-go. He was very polite about it and very delightful, and I'm going to share with you some examples from his correspondence now. But there was one interesting moment in a letter that he wrote to his brother Robert in 1941. This is after the commission was already put in stone, and he'd written most of the piece, the first string quartet already. And he said, quote, about Mrs. Coolidge, "The old girl has just bought a string quartet off me for quite a sum, which will keep the wolf away for a bit," end quote. Now, in even a more crass manner, he made a quip in this letter to his brother about how the medal he was to receive, which was the Coolidge Medal, which he awarded at the DC premiere of the first string quartet for services to chamber music, that this was going to be a gold medal. Turns out it was not a gold medal, and he was basically referring in this letter to the medal as being gold for the sake of going and selling it for the gold weight. So Britten needed money, and you know we can't exactly fault him for that. In 1940, Britten had first suggested writing a piano quintet for Mrs. Coolidge. Though she wasn't able to fulfill this request at that time, she had intended for a piano quintet to go into her programming for a Berkshire Chamber Festival in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, which is, of course, near the home of Tanglewood in Lenox, Massachusetts. And this was due to the instability of her finances in the entering months of the United States into World War II, obviously, in 1941. Mrs. Coolidge said of this situation, quote, "I am by no means sure that my other responsibilities will permit this large item in my budget, nor the state of my own bank account and the pressing necessities of more material assistance may cause me to at least postpone such an idea," end quote. So, Mrs. Coolidge, by the end of 1940, had already decided that she was going to give Benjamin Britten a commission. She made this very clear to her publisher, and in fact, Frank Bridge heard from Boozy and Hawkes that Britten would receive the commission before Britten knew. Britten didn't know until 1941, for sure, until he actually met Mrs. Coolidge in person in California. In a letter, which you see here, Britten expressed his gratitude in that very lovely British way, no offense to anyone, British way of projecting politeness while not necessarily being totally sincere. Quote, "I am writing to say how delighted I am to be writing a string quartet for you and to be played in your concerts next September. It has been a great ambition of mine to write a piece for you, and I know that our dear Frank Bridge, now that he can write no more for you himself, would be tremendously pleased that you have asked me." Bridge had actually passed away in January of 1941 between the time of him finding out Britten would receive the commission and when Britten knew. In a letter in response to Mrs. Coolidge, Frank Bridge stated about Britten, quote, "He is one of the few young composers that really count," end quote. And boy, did that certainly come true over the course of history in the 20th century. Now, we're going to return to that medal that he was going to receive. Benjamin Britten received a letter from Music Division Chief Harold Spivak in June of 1941, just about when he was going to start writing the quartet. And this was a notice that Mrs. Coolidge was going to award him this prestigious medal. The actual quartet, the first quartet, was premiered on September 21st in 1941 in Los Angeles by the Coolidge Quartet. And the DC premiere took place here at the library, which was the second performance in the world, during the Founders Day concert on October 30th of 1941. Now, this concert involved Mrs. Coolidge speaking a bit, of course, and there was a moment when she called Britten by his pet name, Benji. And this was picked up by the press, and Britten was completely horrified. And, but to Mrs. Coolidge's defense, he signed letters and postcards at a certain point as Benji. Now, this postcard is him writing to Mrs. Coolidge to say that the quartet was finished, and he was just finishing up the manuscript to get it out, to get the parts made. This postcard is in a display case for you just down the hall. And before you go into the concert, you can see that actual item, which is very exciting. The reviews were entirely positive, as much as what they can be after a premiere of a quartet. The Times Herald remarked, quote, "Britten's imagination as played in this string quartet has opened new tonal horizons. They unfold in shimmering perspective," end quote. Britten had a notion of English music that was represented by Vaughan Williams, his teacher, of course. And the word that was used to describe this sort of Vaughan Williams-related English music is stodginess. And the same critic who just gave that positive quote remarked, quote, "He says farewell to British stodginess and permits himself no regrets," end quote. Britten was overjoyed. Now, musically, what's interesting in this quartet, which I'm just going to touch upon briefly, is that he was working very hard to push the boundaries of tonal or harmonic expectation. Now, when we listen to music, there's a certain, especially in pop music, for example, there's a pattern that gets used of what keys happen when and what tonic, dominant, back to tonic, and so forth. These patterns sort of are the framework which enables us to feel when the end is coming, for example, or when there's going to be a repeat back to the top, or how you can know that there's a repeat back to the top. So Britten was messing with your expectation of that, and I think you'll hear a bit of that tonight, if you want to. The D major tonality of the quartet is constantly challenged by a nagging C major, or a C. It goes in all kinds of directions in the first movement. That instability is not really truly resolved until the final movement of the quartet. A British poet and critic named Edith Stilwell said of this quartet, quote, "It is still exploding in my head with a blinding light followed by new ideas, points of view, even new vision," end quote. Now, a couple images I'd like to show you. This is the cover of the program from the Library of Congress premiere of the first string quartet by Benjamin Britten. And this is the interior, of course. The other composers whose works were being performed were Randall Thompson, the one with the P of the two that we discussed, and Alexander Tansman. And I think it's safe to say that of these three, Benjamin Britten achieved the greatest fame. This is a wonderful image of the first page of the manuscript. This is actually the photostat negative, it was called. So this is not the image from the original manuscript, but it's basically a negative taken of that document. The actual manuscript is, again, in that display case for you to enjoy later. But here you can see the dedication, of course, to Mrs. Coolidge, and also Britten's signature there. We'll get to him in a minute. So, just a reiteration of the connection to the library, and especially Serge Koussevitzky. The commission of Peter Grimes from early 1942 was dedicated to Koussevitzky's late wife, Natalie. And it awarded Britten a fee of $1,000. Now, if you think about it, that was a lot of money in that time. But to think that one of the most important operas in all of history, subjective, of course, I'll follow my sword if you don't agree, was commissioned and written just for $1,000. That's pretty amazing. There's no composer that would accept that fee for an opera these days. Well, unless it's going to be a bad opera that we know from the get-go. But I didn't say that. Of course, the music division here at the Library of Congress holds all of the manuscripts for the Coolidge Foundation and the Koussevitzky Foundation as well. And there's some exciting happenings coming on with the Koussevitzky Foundation in the next few years, so stay tuned to that. Just one brief mention again of Britten's pacifism. This, of course, was the principal reason, or one of the principal reasons, excuse me, for his emigration to the United States. He was concerned for his own personal longevity, and he didn't want to be sucked into this movement which would completely destroy his career. As early as 1935, he had been rather public about his anti-war ideology in England. He joined a large pacifist group in the United Kingdom called Canon Dick Shepherd's Peace Pledge Union. And while Britten and Piers were in the United States, this was one of my favorite facts in the whole process of preparing this, they were both being monitored by the FBI. And in fact, an investigation order was signed by J. Edgar Hoover. The reason being, Peter Piers was very, very, very connected to communist causes, especially in this country. He was very open about it, and for various reasons, Senator McCarthy and others, of course in a later era, did not like this. But Aaron Copland, Leonard Bernstein are other figures who were drawn into this sort of communist witch hunt that certain people in our government did, or led. In 1940, very interestingly, the Selected Services Registration Act was passed. And that said that anyone between the years of 21 to 35 in the US, Britain was 26, had to register for the draft, even if you were not a citizen. He was an alien, though he was here legally. But that sort of it's one of those things that between 1939 and 41, we're starting to change Britain's tune to want to go back to England. After they left, Britten and Piers left the United States in 1942, they were classified as prohibited immigrants by the US State Department. Think of this, the US State Department banning some of the greatest artists in the history of the world. Anyways. Essentially, this wasn't the end of the world. It just required them to go every time they were to come to the US Embassy in London. They had to go through a rigorous interview process and then get approved for a special one-time visa. And he dealt with that for the rest of his life, and that policy was never changed for him, as far as I am aware of. And another interesting thing, when Britten got back to England, he was subjected to a tribunal for the registration of conscientious objectors. He, by being in the United States, was avoiding the draft in the United Kingdom, of course, so this was a problem, and he had to face the music when he got back. What was interesting was that he was rejected the first time, and then the second time he was afforded conscientious objector status, which was apparently only given to less than 5% of applicants. So needless to say, he pulled quite a few strings to make that happen. In that tribunal, Britten said, quote, "The whole of my life has been devoted to acts of creation, being a professional composer, and I cannot take part in acts of destruction. I believe sincerely that I can help my fellow human beings best by continuing the work I am most qualified to do by the nature of my gifts and training," end quote. Not a popular position in England, 1942. England had been under attack by the Germans and the Axis powers for a long time, and the British people, civilians, were getting slaughtered in the streets in England, in London principally with the Battle of Britain, and around the countryside. And Britten suffered immensely for a period in the press and among his colleagues. And similar to what we're going to discuss with Shostakovich, and it's entirely subjective. These are my views, not the library's or anyone else's. Benjamin Britten and Shostakovich somehow benefited from the dissension that they were putting forth into the public sphere. And likewise, when Benjamin Britten and Dimitri Shostakovich were not doing so well in the public sphere of gossip and that sort of thing, their composition colleagues were being quite opportunistic in trying to go public against Britten and Shostakovich. And it was entirely opportunistic. These lesser composers who were jealous of their success, and part of it I'm sure had to do with ideology, but the attacks were so vicious. You know, how are you're gonna write to Stalin to throw Shostakovich under the bus? It's a tricky thing, to say the least. So of course these issues placed a bit of a veil over Britten's musical accomplishments, but over the ensuing decades, there was no way that the British public could ignore what he was doing for British music within the United Kingdom and also internationally. In 1945, interestingly, Benjamin Britten held a press conference. In this press conference, the sole purpose was to pontificate against Winston Churchill's lavish accommodations and food at the Potsdam Conference, while the people in England were starving. So Britten knew no bounds, and luckily for us, he didn't get in too much trouble for this. Now let's turn to Shostakovich. Without Shostakovich's music, it's not very possible to get a clear perspective of Russian culture in the 20th century. His output included 15 symphonies, music for 37 films, as mentioned earlier, 15 string quartets, as well as many additional chamber and choral works. He is most widely regarded for his symphonies, of course, which at times convey Shostakovich's own interpretation of current events in Russia. The symphonies dated from 1924 through 1971, a huge spread of time in history. The 7th symphony, for example, was entitled Leningrad. He wrote it in the fall of 1941 as the siege of Leningrad was taking place, and it also premiered during this period in Leningrad. And it was essentially written as an homage to the people who were suffering in the city due to the German invasion. Shostakovich's relationship with the Soviet regime was incredibly complex, and it's a topic that has filled many, 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 many books. And my colleagues know those books have been all over my desk for the last few weeks. But there are some that are very interesting, and there's even a lot of controversy within these books. There was a memoir said to be authored by Shostakovich. Most scholars now say it was not. Some people do, well, but in fact, the family actually came out at a point after all this controversy was happening and saying, despite the fact that maybe Shostakovich didn't write most of what was in the book, it conveyed how he actually felt for the most part. So it can be viewed as a special historical document. It was entitled Testament. And it does give insight, of course, into a specific time period of how Shostakovich was being received. Now, what's interesting about Shostakovich, and this is my thesis about him. Most of us know him as this person who was punished by the Soviets, whose music was squashed by them, and we see him as a victim. There were moments when he very clearly was, which I'll get to. There were two big instances, for example, where the regime went completely public in rebuking him for his music. Some of his music was banned, and performances were pulled. People didn't want to conduct his music. People didn't want to play his piano concerto because they feared for their lives. And in these moments, he feared for his life as well. But what's a trend throughout his entire life is civil service, and he wanted to serve the Russian people. In doing so, and in enabling his ability to create music, he had to pander to the regime. And he felt incredibly guilty for this over time. And we'll get into some of the details here that basically paint this picture. And this is just my summation of this. And I encourage you to read some of these books to make your own decision about Shostakovich. So what he received as benefits, which outweighed these two focal problems with the regime, were financial, honorary, and political rewards from the regime. In the years preceding the Lady Macbeth affair, which I will explain momentarily, Shostakovich was elected to the city council in Leningrad as a 28-year-old. That would still be a feat today. In 1941, he volunteered for army service in the Home Guard, which is comparable to our National Guard. He worked as a composer for them, arranging music for battlefront performances. He was appointed deputy to the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Federated Socialist Republic in 1947, a role which he filled until 1962, at which point he was elected to the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. These names all get very confusing, but the gist of it is that he was working for the regime in a very clear manner. In 1957, he had accepted the position of Secretariat of the Union of Composers of the USSR. He had initially refused that appointment in a letter to Stalin's second-in-command, Malenkov, but later changed his mind after about 5 years. That was a post that he held until his death in the 70s. It's murky whether or not Shostakovich truly believed in the ideals of communism. There is some indication in his writings that he had certain sympathies with it, but he had no personal tolerance for the oppression. Now, what's problematic is his tolerance for the regime's oppression. His only statements that came out against the regime were in his music, and they were conveyed in a way that most people at the time couldn't really grasp. And part of that was his need to save his own neck. And he lived in a fear of being thrown into the gulag or being executed. He destroyed all of the mail that he received. And so much of his letters don't exist for study. However, there are actually 4 letters that he had written to Stalin, which exist in the Stalin archive, which is very interesting. Stalin. The Library of Congress has a huge collection of Stalin images in the prints and photographs division. I encourage you to spend some time there if you're interested. And I have some very funny ones, which you'll see in a moment, which you'll actually want to go look for them. So the event that set off the firestorm of public criticism against Shostakovich was his opera The Lady Macbeth of the Mitensk district, which premiered on January 26 in 1936. The opera ran for years, 2 years or so, without problem. And the story goes that Stalin and some of his senior regime colleagues went to a performance and were not happy, basically. And how this came out was 2 days later, after they had attended the performance, an editorial was run in the regime newspaper Pravda, which ripped it to shreds, essentially. The article was entitled, quote, "Muddle instead of music," end quote. It remarked that dissonance, the lack of easily remembered melodies, and shrieks that replaced tuneful singing were indications of Shostakovich, quote, "rejecting opera. Here we have leftist confusion instead of natural human music. The power of good music to infect the masses has been sacrificed to a petty bourgeois formalist attempt to create originality through cheap clowning," end quote. Now, if that wasn't enough, that set off a whole slew of things. People were writing into the regime. They were writing in criticizing Shostakovich to the newspaper. It was a mess. And then on February 6th, this is just a few days later, just over a week, another one appeared entitled Balletic Travesty, which responded to Shostakovich's ballet, The Limpid Stream, calling it, quote, vulgar and stylized, end quote. Public opinion, of course, was swayed by what the regime wanted because people were out for survival. And Shostakovich's fear of, the retribution from the regime began very much prior to this, but this was the point. He was essentially pushing the boundaries and then waiting to see what was going to be the stopping point for the regime, and this was the first point. The Moscow Composers Union even held 3 open sessions to denunciate Shostakovich. His music was labeled formalistic in reference to guidelines of censure established by the Central Committee of the Communist Party in 1932. The president of the union, now this is a composers union, think of ASCAP doing this, or BMI. I think my colleague David would cringe if they were trying to do this. So the suggestion from the union president was, quote, every composition should be considered formalistic in which the composer fundamentally does not have as his aim the presenting of new social meanings, but focuses his interest only on inventing new combinations of sound that have not been done before, end quote. Now, that was the regime position that was against Shostakovich. But the evidence that goes in favor of Shostakovich from the regime completely outweighs this, and then the later incidents in the late 40s. The negative response to Lady Macbeth ought to be interpreted as the regime making an example out of Shostakovich to the other composers and the other musicians and artists in the Soviet Union. It benefited the regime greatly to have this firm hold over the arts community, because as those of us that are artists know, and those of you who come as patrons to our programs, the arts are a vehicle for social change and provoking thought and social progress. Now the problem is the regime wanted to put a vice grip on that in order to do the opposite. What they thought was progress, but was more a closed system, to say the least. Now what was interesting was in a private meeting, Stalin had remarked, quote, now when an explanation has been given in Pravda, referring to the first editorial, all our composers should start creating music that is transparent and understandable and not rebuses and riddles in which the meaning of the work dies, end quote. Now, again, the responses that were thrown around in the public were composers throwing Shostakovich under the bus because they thought that agreeing with the regime was their best shot for getting commissions, getting work, money, all those sorts of things, and survival as well. Ideology was very flexible in this whole period because when you're living under that sort of totalitarian existence, life is different. The public admonishments sparked a long depression and period of alcoholism for Shostakovich, which he endured for the rest of his life. And in 1936, getting into the results of the first problem with the regime, the premiere of the Fourth Symphony was withdrawn. It had been scheduled for December 1936. The government had banned all further performances of Lady Macbeth, and Shostakovich never wrote another opera. He instead focused on the more abstract genres like the symphony and the string quartet, which enabled him to convey his ideas in a way which wasn't as explicit to the audience. So someone could get his interpretation or get their own. And that was largely how he was able to survive in this climate. Now, if Stalin's machine had truly despised Shostakovich, it would not have been possible for him to join the staff of the Leningrad Conservatoire in 1937. His Fifth Symphony would not have premiered in November 1937 as a triumph, which was musically a clear example of Russian nationalism. The piano quintet, Opus 57, however, confirmed Shostakovich's favor with the regime. This was the moment where he received his first Stalin Prize. It's not possible to go from, someone that realistically going to get thrown into the gulag or shot or beheaded or whatever, to be the #1 composer to the regime in just a couple years. So it's clear that the regime was using him to their advantage. The piano quintet was composed in the summer of 1940 while Shostakovich was on vacation in Luga. It was preceded by a Sixth Symphony, which was not very well received at the time. The quintet was first performed in October of the same year in a private performance by the Glazunov Quartet with Shostakovich at the piano. This was for the Leningrad Composers Union. It was repeated that evening as an encore, so immediately it was popular. After this hearing, the board of the union recommended it for the Stalin Prize, which was later awarded. The quintet was performed again 10 days later in Moscow by the Beethoven Quartet, and the official public premiere took place on November 23rd at the Moscow Conservatoire during a Soviet music festival. Again, the same point of Shostakovich would not have been put in these high-profile situations representing the entirety of the Soviet Union unless he was acting in the manner that the regime wanted him to. Prokofiev praised the quintet after it premiered, and Pravda, this is just a couple years after the scathing editorials, called it, quote, the unquestionably best composition of 1940, end quote. Strong words. The Stalin Prize that was awarded to the quintet was of 100,000 rubles, a huge sum of money at that time, and according to some sources was the largest sum of money that had been given to that point, at least under the Stalin regime. In 1943, there's an interesting story of Stalin holding a composition for a new Soviet national anthem. Candidates who made it to the final round were Prokofiev, Shostakovich, and Khachaturian. The anthem that Shostakovich wrote was rated a 10 out of 10 by Stalin. However, Stalin wasn't entirely sold. He said, quote, your music is very good, but what can I do? Alexandrov's song is more suitable for an anthem. Shostakovich at this time feared being pronounced dead, of course, but Stalin then retorted saying, quote, as for Shostakovich, he should be thanked, end quote. Curiously, in this situation, though Shostakovich was not the winning anthem composer, he received the largest award of all of them. His award was 32,000 rubles. The composer who won received only 12,000. Again, to my point. 1948 brought the next serious round of formalist problems with the government, against the artist communities. Shostakovich had been named in February as a dissident in this campaign, and several of his works were banned. He lost his teaching posts again that summer, but by the next spring, he was already back in the favor of the regime. In a phone call, Stalin himself said to Shostakovich, quote, we have criticized you, but we criticized you because we love you, end quote. There's a certain point where I stopped feeling bad for Shostakovich because he was benefiting from the situation. He could have attempted to escape the Soviet Union if his ideology was so strong. There were later instances where Stalin had asked Shostakovich to serve on the official delegations for the Soviet Union to various events around the world. One of them was the Cultural and Scientific Congress for World Peace in New York. Now, as we're getting to the conclusion here, I just want to touch upon one brief quote that Shostakovich said that sums up this whole experience with the Soviets, and then we're going to compare Britten and Shostakovich in two shakes. Excuse the language, but this was a direct quote from Shostakovich. Quote, I've been a whore, I am and always will be a whore, end quote. He knew what he was doing with the Soviets, and it tormented him for the entirety of his life, and he was in a permanent state of depression as a result. And the nature of war and such, and an oppressive society merits a certain flexibility with how we judge characters. But I strongly urge you to revisit Shostakovich in your own personal reading and studies. This is a very cute cartoon that the library has done by Herbert Herblock of Shostakovich. And you can see the politics are involved and also directly with music, as the globe is split in half and shown as two timpani, with Europe being as one and Asia as the other. And in the background, you see a cartoon of a man holding a bass drum as if marching, saying political campaigns. So this is perfectly emblematic of everything we've been talking about tonight. Shostakovich is represented here by the music, and Stalin is represented on top. And there is no separation from the music and culture from the political goings-on. Here's just some more about Stalin. Now, Britten and Shostakovich. What's so phenomenal about these two figures is that they became friends in the later part of their lives. They both had these very special and unique impacts upon their countries, their societies, and internationally, which was not matched, perhaps, by many other people at this time. In a letter to Shostakovich, Britten said, quote, for years now, your work and life have been an example to me of courage, integrity, and human sympathy, and of wonderful invention and clear vision. I must say that there is no one composing today who has an equal influence on me, end quote. Now, how did they come to know each other? Britten came to know Shostakovich musically in 1936 when he saw one of the first performances of Lady Macbeth in London on March 18th, 1936. Interestingly, Peter Pears sang the role of second foreman in this production, even though the two didn't meet until 1937. It's an interesting connection. Britten was unusually impressed by this music, and in his letters he makes it very clear that he was astounded by Shostakovich's prowess and his music, and throughout the rest of Britten's life, the evidence explicitly says that there was no other composer but Shostakovich for Britten of that level. And there was a period where Alban Berg had passed away, and Berg was one of Britten's idols musically, and he thought that Shostakovich would be the only comparable person to fill that gap. Now, Britten and Shostakovich first met each other at the Royal Festival Hall in London in September of 1960 when they went to hear Rostropovich perform Shostakovich's cello concerto. This begins an interesting relationship of three people that has touched us in Washington, of course, with Rostropovich's music direction of the National Symphony and Britten's involvement here at the library and so on and so forth. The three musicians, along with their spouses and significant others, became good friends over the years. Britten traveled to the Soviet Union 6 times in his life, several times on official diplomatic trips for the United Kingdom and other times personally. And after receiving Britten's score of the War Requiem in 1963, Shostakovich, mirroring exactly what Britten had did essentially, remarked about Britten, quote, "You great composer, I little composer." He said that to Britten's face. The mutual admiration that these two figures had for each other is astounding, and it's absolutely wonderful that they were able to connect despite all the problems going on in the world. There were some very funny personal stories that those three characters shared. They spent Christmas and New Year's together in 1967 in Russia. Christmas dinner was spent at Slava's outside of Moscow, and then on New Year's Day they did a bit of a house crawl, going from house to house, having one course at Slava's, one course at Shostakovich's house, and then another course at a neighbor's who was a nuclear physicist. Shostakovich's only visit to Britten's home in Aldborough came in 1972, and Shostakovich didn't make more trips than this at this point because he was rather ill and had lung cancer and other issues going on. Each composer had dedicated works to the other. Britten dedicated his opera The Prodigal Son to Dimitri Shostakovich, and Shostakovich's most prominent dedication to Britten was the 14th Symphony. Britten conducted the English/British premiere of the work at the 1970 Aldborough Festival. While the two were usually compared favorably, some people did not agree that, well, they compared them together, but not favorably. Unsurprisingly, the musicologist and philosopher Theodor Adorno, those of you that know of him won't be surprised by this, suggested that Britten had a, quote, taste for bad taste, a simplicity founded in ignorance, immaturity that fancies itself clear-minded, and a lack of technical capacity. He also threw Stravinsky into this bunch. So Adorno, who is the basis of many musicology seminars, is fascinating, to say the least. Now, aside from the music, as they shared these personal stories, Shostakovich and Britten were very much kindred spirits. Their ideologies were not entirely the same, but they were both grounding their music in the sense of telling how they felt to the world. Whether or not it was going to be responded to or not was not the issue. They used music and culture as a vehicle for provoking thought. And that is what I think any musician hopes to do with their work. Sometimes in the commercial sphere that's not the case, but certainly at the library we hope to provoke wonderful thoughts. Excellent. I'm not going to go on too much further, because I know we want to get ready for the concert, which is very exciting. The sense that these two men changed music in the 20th century is fact. Whether or not you like what it did, or whether or not you agree to what extent they impacted music, that's a different story. But their influence on certain genres, for example, Britten with opera, or Shostakovich with the symphony, was met by very few other composers in other genres in the 20th century. Yes, other people are on the same level, and other people are more significant in different reasons. But these two men, what is most important for me is that they really use their music to convey the ideals that they thought should be the case for their countries. And that's something that we see in contemporary composers such as John Adams in his operas Nixon in China or The Death of Klinghoffer, or his oratorio El Niño, which it brings in Latino culture into the biblical settings of the Christmas story and such. Now, John Adams, I bring him up because we are having a John Adams residency here in the spring. He will be here for a week, conducting the International Contemporary Ensemble. There will be premieres of works by him. The Taka Quartet will be here, as well as Army Blues will be performing over the Atlas, presented by the library with John Adams. So the connection between Benjamin Britten and Shostakovich to the library is very clear. These are composers who use their music to change the world, or at least to attempt to change the world. And here at the library, we have the great pride of fostering this sort of creativity through our commissions and through presenting concerts and lectures and special presentations for you, the public, because that's who ultimately we are here to serve. And I hope I have not bored you too much this evening. There's so much to discuss about these two figures. It's endless, and I strongly encourage you to go out and do some of your own reading or looking at our website, loc.gov. The Performing Arts Encyclopedia, which we have on those portals, is a fascinating source of digital images of the scores, as you've seen here tonight, and also the photos and scans of photos and etchings and paintings and that sort of thing. So without further ado, thank you so much, and enjoy the Takash Quartet this evening.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.